He looked me in the eye in front of his entire pack and said 5 words that I will never forget for the rest of my life. You should not exist. Not you don't belong here. Not you're not welcome. Not even the standard pack dismissal that lower wolves had come to expect from a man of his position. You should not exist. And the worst part, the part that kept me awake that night, staring at the ceiling of the borrowed room I'd been given at the edge of his territory, was that I had heard those exact words before. Different voice, same meaning, different man, same hatred. And both times, I had stood completely still and let the words land without flinching, because I had learned, very early, that flinching was the most dangerous thing a wolf in my position could do. What I did not know, what neither of us knew, standing in that courtyard with his pack watching and the silence sitting heavy and cold between us, was that in 3 months, everything he believed about me would be proven wrong. Not by me, by him, by the thing inside him that he had no control over and no way to prepare for, by the mate bond that would break him open like a fault line. Like the video. Hit that subscribe button right now and drop in the comments where you're watching from. I have people watching from every corner of this world, and I want to see your city. Because this story, this one right here, is the one that's going to make you feel everything. Now let me take you back to the beginning. Because before you can understand what happened in that courtyard, you need to understand what brought me there. And what brought me there was a war that ended before I was old enough to understand what war meant, and a name that had been a death sentence in 6-packs for 22 years. My name. Her name was Vesna Cray, and the name Cray was not a simple thing to carry. In the years before Vesna's birth, the Cray pack had been one of the most powerful in the Northern Territories. Not through territory size. The Cray lands were modest compared to the great packs of the mountain regions, but through bloodline. Through an ancient lineage that predated most pack structures in the region, a line of wolves with a particular kind of ability that the pack records called void touch, and that everyone else called something far less clinical. Void touch was rare. It appeared, when it appeared, once or twice in a generation. What it meant, in practical terms, was this: a wolf with void touch could perceive the mate bond before it fully manifested. Not in others, in themselves. They could feel the direction of the bond months, sometimes years, before the formal recognition happened. They felt the pull, the warmth, the compass needle's certainty of it, while the mate on the other side felt nothing yet. It sounds like a gift. In the wrong political climate, it is a weapon. Because knowing whose bond was whose before either party understood it meant you knew, before anyone else knew, exactly where power was going to consolidate, which alphas would bond with which bloodlines, which alliances were coming before they were arranged. The Cray pack had used this knowledge carefully, responsibly, for generations. And then, 23 years ago, someone in a position of power had decided that a pack with that kind of foreknowledge was too dangerous to exist. The war had lasted 11 months. The Cray pack was not destroyed. Eliminating an entire bloodline outright would have been a line that even the most aggressive packs would not cross in public. But it was dismantled. The land was taken. The ranked members were scattered into other packs under conditional acceptance agreements. The void touch bloodline was declared dormant, a legal fiction, since you can't legislate a genetic trait into non-existence, and the name Cray was registered with the regional elder seat as a watchlist designation, which meant that anywhere Vesna went, any pack she sought shelter in, any compound that processed her paperwork, any ranked wolf who ran a name check on her, the word watchlist appeared, and with it, inevitably, a version of those 5 words. You should not exist. She was 22 years old. She had never hurt anyone. She had never used the void touch ability that she had, in fact, had since she was 17, in any way that resembled the political manipulation it had been weaponized for before her birth. She had, for the last 4 years since her mother died and left her without pack shelter, been surviving on conditional acceptance agreements of her own. 3 months here, 6 months there. A careful, itinerant existence built on being useful enough that packs didn't immediately turn her away and unremarkable enough that they didn't dig too deeply into the watch list notation. It worked until it didn't. It stopped working in the Harkon pack when the new beta's mate discovered Vesna's full name in a routine filing and made the decision above the existing agreement. Vesna had 12 hours to leave. She had been on the road for 2 weeks when she crossed the border of Dravik territory. The Dravik pack held the largest single territory in the northern region. Not the most populous, but the most extensive, a vast stretch of forested land and river valley and high-clearance mountain passes that gave whoever held it a strategic position that had made it the most contested and most defended territory in the region for 2 centuries. The Dravik Alphas had held it through exactly the combination of force and governance that large territories required, and they had built a reputation over those 2 centuries that was unambiguous. The current Alpha was a man named Harkon Dravik. He was 31. He had taken the Alpha mantle at 26 after his father's death in a border conflict that the official accounts called a skirmish and the unofficial ones called something considerably larger. He had consolidated the territory's defenses in the 5 years since with a ruthlessness that his allies found reassuring and his enemies found instructive. He was not, by any account Vesna had gathered, a cruel man, but he was a hard one. And the Cray watch list notation was not something that a hard man in a strategically contested territory would view with anything approaching neutrality. She knew this. She crossed his border anyway. Because she was out of alternatives, out of territory, and the winter was coming in from the north with a particular ferocity that year. And because the void touch, the ability she had never asked for and had spent 5 years wishing she'd been born without, was pointing, with a certainty that frightened her, directly into Dravik land. She had never felt the void touch this strongly before. It wasn't a pull toward a specific person. Not yet. It was more like a gravity, a directional certainty that sat in her chest and didn't waver regardless of how inconvenient its implications were. She had felt it building for 2 months. It had been one of the reasons she'd left the Harkon pack before the beta's mate forced the issue. She had been planning to leave anyway, had been on the edge of the decision, because the void touch was pointing away from Harkon, and she'd learned early that arguing with it was a form of self-harm. She did not know what was waiting for her in Dravik territory. She walked into it on a Tuesday in early November, with a pack on her back and frost on her boots, and presented herself at the first checkpoint she came to. The guard who ran her name check took 40 seconds to complete it. Then he looked at her with an expression she recognized as the controlled version of alarm. "You'll need to come with me," he said. They brought her to the main compound. She had been through this before, different compounds, different guards, different versions of the walk between the checkpoint and the decision-making room. Enough times that she'd developed a particular internal state for it. Not calm, exactly. Something more like suspended. A state of waiting for the verdict without investing in it. Because investment was how you lost composure, and composure was the one currency that never entirely ran out. The compound was large. She registered details as she walked, the way she always did. A habit built from years of needing to understand a place quickly, to know which exits existed and which doors were worth remembering and which people in a crowd were paying the kind of attention that signaled authority. The architecture was solid, stone and heavy timber, built for permanence rather than aesthetics. The wolves she passed were not hostile, but they watched her in the way that people watch something they have been told to watch, and she noted the weight of it and filed it away. She was brought to a courtyard. Open, square, stone paved. The kind of space that had clearly been designed for public occasions, for announcements, for formal pack gatherings, for the kind of events that required visibility. He was standing in the center of it. She recognized him before anyone told her who he was, because there was only one way a man stood in the center of a courtyard in his own compound, like the space existed around him rather than containing him. Like gravity ran slightly different in his vicinity. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, and he was looking at her with the specific quality of attention that, she would later understand, he reserved for things he considered problems requiring immediate classification. She crossed the courtyard without hurrying. She stopped a respectful distance away. She met his eyes. This was the moment. She had learned to read these moments. The 5 seconds in which everything was decided, whether a person would engage with her as a human being or as a file notation. He looked at her for 3 of those seconds. Then he said it. You should not exist. Not shouted. Not dramatic. Quiet and level and absolutely certain. The voice of a man delivering an assessment rather than an insult, which somehow made it worse. The courtyard was not empty. A dozen wolves at least, members of his inner circle and senior pack, standing at the edges. All watching. Vesna stood still. She let the words land. She breathed. Then, in the same quiet level tone he had used, and yet here I am. Something moved through the courtyard. A shift in the air, a ripple through the watching wolves. Someone at the far edge made a sound that might have been a quickly suppressed laugh. Harkon Dravik's eyes changed. Just slightly. An adjustment, like a lens refocusing. He studied her for a moment that was longer than it needed to be for pure assessment. Why did you come here? He asked. I needed somewhere to be, she said simply. Your territory was the option available. You know what your name triggers when it's run. I know exactly what it triggers. I've been watching it trigger for 4 years. And you came anyway. I'm still here. Another moment of that refocused attention. She had the sense of being calculated, not maliciously, but precisely. The way a man who deals in strategic territory calculates every new variable that enters his field. 3 days, he said finally. You can stay 3 days. You'll be watched. You won't access the main compound. You'll be housed in the East Annex, and you'll have no contact with ranked pack members. A pause. At the end of 3 days, you leave. It was not generous. It was, by his standards, she would later understand, almost uncharacteristically so. Thank you, she said. She meant it. He turned and walked away, and she stood in the courtyard and felt the void touch settle in her chest like an anchor dropping, pointing in his direction, with a certainty that made her close her eyes for one brief, private moment. Oh, she thought. Oh no. The East Annex was exactly what he'd said. Edge of the compound, modest, functional, separated from the main buildings by a stretch of open ground that made the isolation clear without requiring a locked door. Her guard was a young wolf named Peter, who was professional and watchful and who brought her meals without commentary and answered her practical questions without warmth, but without hostility either. She appreciated the consistency. She spent the first day getting her bearings in the limited geography available to her. She spent the second day thinking. The void touch was not a subtle sensation. She had spent 5 years learning to live alongside it without being consumed by it. But that had been in conditions where it was a low-level awareness, a compass needle that moved slowly, that she could acknowledge and set aside for hours at a time. This was different. This was the void touch at its loudest setting, which meant she was close to the source. Which meant the bond, the actual bond, the full formal mate bond, was somewhere in the near future, close enough that the void touch was registering it with the same certainty it reserved for things that were about to become real. And the source was Harkon Dravik, the man who had told her she should not exist, the alpha of the most strategically significant pack in the Northern Territory. A man who, if she had read him correctly in those few minutes in the courtyard, operated from a position of absolute conviction about his own assessments. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the East Annex and had what she could only describe as a very difficult conversation with herself about the nature of fate and whether it was allowed to have a sense of humor this dark. Then she made a decision. She was not going to tell him. Not now. Not in 3 days, under a watch list cloud, in a borrowed room at the edge of his compound. Not while he was looking at her with the expression of a man managing an inconvenient security variable. She was going to do the only thing she could do. She was going to leave in 3 days as agreed, find somewhere stable to survive the winter, and see what the bond did when she was no longer in proximity. If it faded, if the void touch had been wrong, or incomplete, or pointing to something else, she would have her answer. If it didn't fade, she would have a different kind of answer. Either way, she would have something to work with. On the third day, Peter came in the morning with breakfast and the information that the Alpha wanted to see her before she left. She had been half expecting this. She followed Peter to the main compound for the first time, through the open ground between the annex and the central buildings, across a covered corridor, into a room that functioned as a working office rather than a formal meeting space. Filing systems, maps on the wall, a desk with active paperwork on it, not staged for an occasion. He was at the desk when she entered. He looked up, the assessment look again, recalibrating on her in real time. "Sit down," he said, with the automatic courtesy of someone who gives instructions rather than invitations. She sat. "I want to ask you something," he said. Directly. "All right." The void touch. "Your bloodline." He looked at her steadily. "Do you have it?" This was the question she had been preparing for since the courtyard. She had turned over several versions of the answer in the East Annex, and had arrived at the only one she could live with. "Yes." "Are you using it?" "No." And then, because honesty felt like the only solid ground available, "Not intentionally." His eyes sharpened. "What does not intentionally mean?" "It means the void touch isn't a tool I switch on and off," she said carefully. "It's a perception, like having better than average hearing. I don't choose what I pick up, and I don't always have context for what I'm sensing." A pause. "What I mean is, it's functioning the way it functions. But I'm not doing anything with what it tells me." He was quiet for a moment. "What is it telling you?" he asked. Flat. Direct. Completely unashamed of the question. She looked at him. She made the decision in less than a second. "Nothing that concerns Dravik territory's security," she said. Not a lie. Not the truth. The specific stripe of careful honesty that she developed for exactly these situations. He looked at her for a long time. She had the sense, again, of being calculated. But now, underneath the calculation, there was something else. A layer she hadn't registered in the courtyard, possibly because the courtyard had been too public for it to surface. A discomfort that was not irritation. Something quieter and less identifiable. "You're not what I expected," he said, in the tone of someone who had not intended to say that aloud. "I'm rarely what people expect," she said. "The file tends to precede me." Something flickered in his expression. Not quite amusement. Adjacent. "Where will you go?" he asked. "I haven't decided." True. She had spent 2 days thinking about everything except the practical answer to that question. He looked at the desk, then back at her, then at the desk again, which she recognized as the physical manifestation of an internal decision process. "The Dravik territory has a settlement at the northern edge," he said carefully. "Outside the main compound. Wolves who are not formally packed, but hold provisional residency under work agreements. He stopped. "It is not a comfortable situation, but it's shelter, and it's within the territory's protection boundary." She went very still. "You're offering me provisional residency." "I'm explaining that the option exists." A pause. "What you do with that information is your decision." She studied him. He was looking at the wall map rather than at her, and the set of his jaw had the quality of someone who had made an uncharacteristic decision and was not prepared to examine it too closely. "Why?" she asked. He looked at her then. "Because it's winter, and you have nowhere to go. And the watch list notation on your file is 22 years old, and based on a political decision that was made before you were born. A beat. And because I make decisions about the people in my territory based on what I observe, not what a file tells me." She felt something shift in her chest. Not the void touch, though the void touch was very much present, very much attentive, very much pointing directly at this man with the intensity of a compass needle north of the pole. Something else. Something that had nothing to do with ability or bloodline or the fate encoded into her biology. Something simpler and considerably more dangerous. "I'll take the provisional residency," she said quietly. He nodded, looked back at the desk, and picked up his pen. "Peter will arrange the paperwork," he said, and his voice had returned to the functional, precise tone of the Alpha's operating mode. "You'll check in with the settlement administrator once a week. Standard conditions apply." "Understood." She stood to leave. "Vesna." She stopped. The void touch. He didn't look up from the paperwork. "If it tells you anything relevant to this territory's security, you'll be the first to know," she said. He nodded. She left. And in the long corridor outside his office, alone for the first time since the courtyard, she pressed her back against the stone wall and breathed, and told herself very firmly that she was not going to let this become something she couldn't manage. She was not entirely convincing. The northern settlement was called Brackwater. It was small, 40-something wolves in 11 structures, built against a natural rock face that provided shelter on the northern side. The wolves here were, like her, people for whom the standard pack structure didn't quite apply. Former members of disbanded packs. Wolves with complicated histories. Wolves between situations. People who needed the protection of Dravik territory without the formal commitment of pack membership. It was not comfortable, as Harkon had said, but it was real. It had a fire and a supply arrangement with the main compound, and a settlement administrator named Gora who was 60 years old and had absolutely no patience for drama, and who looked at Vesna's paperwork, looked at Vesna, and said, "You can have the East Room in Building 3. Don't make problems." Vesna did not make problems. She found work quickly. The settlement's records were a mess, maintained in a system that had clearly been built by someone who had strong opinions and limited organizational skill. She reorganized them over 2 weeks and presented Gora with a functional filing structure that cut the administrator's weekly paperwork time by half. Gora looked at the result with the expression of someone encountering competence after a long drought and said, "The compound's administrator owes me a favor. I'm going to mention your name." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," Gora said, already walking away. The compound's administrator contact led to a part-time records arrangement with the main compound, which meant twice-weekly trips from Brackwater to the central buildings. Which meant that Vesna, who had been extremely careful to manage her void touch awareness as a private internal matter and not something that influenced her movements, now had a logistical reason to be in the compound's vicinity on a regular basis. She did not examine this too closely. The void touch was getting louder. She had hoped, genuinely hoped, with the particular desperation of someone who understood what she was hoping against, that the proximity effect would diminish over time, that the first intensity had been an artifact of the first encounter, of novelty, of something that would settle into background noise once she'd been in the territory long enough. It did not settle. If anything, the awareness sharpened with each week that passed. It had developed a texture now, which it hadn't had in the first days. Not just direction and intensity, but character. She began to be able to sense, vaguely, non-specifically, the emotional temperature on the other end of the void touch. Not Harkon's specific feelings. She couldn't read minds, and the void touch wasn't telepathy, but broad strokes. The difference between tension and ease. Between his baseline composure and something that disrupted it. She sensed more disruption than she would have expected in a man of his reputation for steadiness. She started to notice things during her twice-weekly compound visits. Nothing dramatic. Just the quality of the administrative staff's energy. The way certain conversations stopped when she walked into rooms. The particular pattern of Harkon's schedule, visible in the compound calendar she accessed for record work, that showed him staying later than his usual pattern, running longer, working through hours that even the Dravik Alpha's reportedly demanding schedule didn't normally require. She noticed, on her 4th compound visit, that he had added a standing meeting on Tuesday evenings with no participants listed and no agenda. She noticed, on her 5th visit, that the standing Tuesday meeting was in the main archive room, which contained the historical records of the Dravik Pack going back to its founding. On her 6th visit, which was a Wednesday, She crossed paths with him in the main corridor. It was the first time she'd seen him since the office conversation 6 weeks ago. He stopped. She stopped. He looked at her with the assessing look, and then something else, that layer she'd registered in his office, the one she still hadn't been able to name. It was more present now, less buried. Gora says your record system has reduced her weekly administrative burden by 6 hours, he said. The previous system had some structural issues, she said. Gora hasn't said anything kind about an administrative system in 20 years. A pause. You've been here 6 weeks. I know. He looked at her for a moment in that particular way that was different from the calculating look. Less like assessment, more like something he wasn't sure what to do with. How are you finding Brackwater? He asked. It was a simple question. A courtesy question. The kind any administrator would ask of a new provisional resident. From Harkon Dravik, who had told her she should not exist, and who she'd had exactly 2 conversations with in 6 weeks, it felt like something else. It's good, she said honestly. Gora runs a tight operation. The people are real. A pause. It's the most stable I've been in 4 years. Something moved through his expression. Fast. Gone before she could identify it. Good, he said, in the same flat tone as before, and walked on. She stood in the corridor and felt the void touch thrumming in her chest like a plucked string, and knew, with the particular helpless certainty of someone who has been receiving accurate information from their own biology for 5 years, that the next phase of this was coming. She just didn't know what shape it would take. The shape it took was a crisis. It arrived on a Thursday in January, fast and loud, and completely without warning. Vesna was in the archive room doing record work when the compound's alarm system, a low, resonant tone built into the stone of the main building's walls, activated. Not the security perimeter alarm, the internal one, which meant something had gone wrong inside the territory rather than at its borders. She stayed where she was, as provisional residents were supposed to do in emergency conditions. She heard the running, the raised voices at the controlled pitch of people responding to something real, the particular quality of organized urgency. After 40 minutes, the tone stopped. After an hour, Peter came to find her. The Alpha wants you, he said, and his face told her that this was not a routine request. She followed him to the medical wing. There were 6 wolves on the treatment tables, a 7th on the floor, already past help. A pack healer moving between them with the focused efficiency of crisis medicine. Standing in the doorway, surveying the room with an expression she'd never seen on him before, was Harkon. It was not composure. It was the controlled version of something that was not composed at all. The specific face of a man holding himself together through will alone because the situation required it, and because he would not break in front of his people. He turned when she entered. His eyes landed on her. 3 of them aren't going to make it through the night, he said, without preamble. 2 more are stable. One is, he stopped. The healer needs help. His assistant is one of the injured. I'm told you have administrative skills, but I'm also told you have field first aid training from your time in the Harvin pack. She did. She had acquired it precisely because she was always in situations where being useful was the difference between staying and leaving. Tell me what you need, she said. She worked for 6 hours straight. Not the dramatic kind of working, not surgery, not miracles. The necessary kind. Monitoring. Records. Assisting the healer with the 1,000 small precise tasks that experienced medical staff took for granted, and that, without proper support, became the bottleneck that cost lives. 2 of the 3 critical cases made it to morning. The 3rd did not. By dawn, the healer, a strained man named Culford, had fallen asleep in his chair, and the compound was in the particular exhausted quiet that follows a night of sustained emergency. Vesna was sitting in the corridor outside the medical wing, her hands in her lap, when Harkon came out. He stood in the corridor and looked at her for a moment. Thank you, he said. The same 2 words she'd heard from a different Alpha months ago, but carrying an entirely different weight. I'm sorry about the one you lost, she said. His jaw tightened. Brennan. He'd been with the pack for 12 years. A pause. He had 3 children. She didn't try to say something appropriate. There wasn't anything appropriate. Harkon lowered himself to the floor of the corridor. Not gracefully, not carefully, just the motion of a man whose body was filing a formal complaint about the last 18 hours, and sat with his back against the wall. She stayed where she was, 2 feet away, also against the wall. They sat in silence for a while. It was a different silence from any they'd shared before. Not the courtyard silence or the office silence. This one had no performance in it. No calculation. It was just 2 people at the end of something hard, not quite ready to re-enter the world. "Can I ask you something?" he said, without turning to look at her. "Yes." "Why did you come here?" "To Dravik territory." "You knew what the name check would trigger. You knew what I would think. You had to know it would be hostile." He paused. "There are other territories. There are packs with less history with the Cray name. Why here?" She was quiet for a moment. The honest answer was the void touch. The bond compass pointing into his territory with a certainty she hadn't been able to argue with. But the honest answer was also the one that would change everything about this conversation, and she needed to think about whether she was ready for that. "I was out of good options," she said carefully, "and something told me to go this direction." She paused. "I've learned to listen to that." He turned his head and looked at her. "Something told you." "Yes." The void touch. In a manner of speaking. He held her gaze for a moment. "You said in my office that it wasn't telling you anything relevant to this territory's security," he said. "It wasn't. But it was telling you something." She held his gaze. "Yes." "Are you going to tell me what?" The corridor was empty. The medical wing was quiet. The compound, outside the windows at the far end, was graying into early morning. "Not yet," she said honestly. He looked at her for a long time, longer than any of the previous looks, which had all been various forms of assessment. This one was different. It wasn't calculating. It was searching. The look of a man trying to understand something with tools that weren't quite adequate for the job. "Okay," he said finally. "Not why not. Not that's unacceptable. Just okay." She breathed. They sat in the corridor for another 20 minutes, not speaking, until the compound began to stir around them, and the day's necessity reasserted itself, and they both stood up, separately, and went back to being what they were supposed to be in each other's presence. But something had changed. She felt it clearly. The void touch confirmed it. The emotional temperature on the other end had shifted. Not dramatically. Not in a way that most people would notice. But she wasn't most people. The weeks that followed had a different quality. She continued her twice-weekly compound visits. The record work expanded. Culford, the pack healer, recruited her to help organize the medical archive, which was even more chaotic than the general records had been. She worked alongside Culford's recovering assistant, a wolf named Isara, who was 20 years old and wry-humored, and who regarded Vesna initially with the watchful wariness that most people in the compound did, and then, as weeks passed, and Vesna was consistently and unremarkably herself, with something that approached friendship. Isara was the one who told her things. Not strategically, the young wolf wasn't political, just conversationally. The natural way of someone who had spent too much time recovering in a small medical office and was thrilled to have company that talked back. She told Vesna about the territory's history, about the crisis in January, a group of wolves who had attempted to cross the eastern border for reasons that were still being investigated, and the conflict that had resulted when the border guards intercepted them, about the 3 children Brennan had left behind, who had been taken in by extended pack family, about how Harkon had gone personally to the family to deliver the news, which was not something alphas were required to do, but which was something, according to Isara, that he always did. She told Vesna about the previous alpha, Harkon's father, who had been formidable in different ways, less precise, more volatile, whose war with the Cray pack had been driven by something that nobody in the current compound talked about openly, but that everyone knew. He lost his mate in that war. Isara said one afternoon, without particular drama, the way she shared most things. Harkon's mother. She was a casualty of a Cray border crossing. He never recovered from it. That's why the name. She stopped, seemed to reconsider. That's why the reaction is what it is. Vesna was very still. He blamed the Cray pack directly? He blamed the specific wolves who crossed the border, Isara said carefully. But grief does what grief does. It made the whole name toxic for him. And then for the territory, because he was the alpha and his grief became pack culture. She looked at Vesna with a gentleness that acknowledged this was not comfortable information. Harkon grew up with that. With the name Cray as a wound. As the thing that took his mother. Vesna sat with this for a long time. It recontextualized everything. Not just the courtyard moment. Not just the you should not exist. But the fact that provisional residency had been offered at all. The fact that a man who had grown up with Cray as a wound had looked at a Cray wolf sitting in his courtyard and found, somewhere in himself, the capacity to offer 3 days and then a settlement option. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, considerable. The moment the void touch shifted from loud to deafening happened on a Saturday evening in late February. She was walking back from the compound to Brackwater, a 20-minute walk along a forest path, familiar enough now that she didn't need to think about the route. It was cold and clear, and the moon was close to full and very bright through the bare trees. She heard footsteps behind her and turned. Harkon. Running clothes, not compound work clothes. He'd been on the evening run he apparently took most days. She had known this from the schedule. In the abstract way she knew most things about his patterns from the records. She had not expected to encounter it in person. He slowed to a walk when he saw her. Fell into step beside her, without particularly announcing that he was going to. They walked in silence for a minute. "You're going back to Brackwater," he said. "Yes. It's late. I had work to finish in the archive." A pause. "The Culver system is going to take another 2 weeks before it's properly cross-referenced. Culford appreciates it. He's easy to work with. He knows what he needs. A beat. Isara speaks well of you," he said. The same tone he always used, flat, precise, not quite as flat as it had been in the beginning. "She doesn't easily. She's honest," Vesna said. "I find honest easier than kind." Something shifted in his pace. A slight change, barely perceptible. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." The Tuesday meetings in the archive. She kept her eyes on the path. The ones with no agenda and no participants. "What are you reading?" A silence. "The Cray records," he said at last. She stopped walking. He stopped a step later and turned to look at her. "There are 40 years of them," he said. "Before the war. The record of what the Cray pack actually was, not what it became in," he paused. "Not what it became in my father's account of it." He looked at her steadily. "I wanted to understand what I was dealing with before I formed a final position on it." "You've been doing this since I arrived," she said. "Since the first weeks." "Yes." She breathed. "And?" He looked at her in the moonlight. The composure was present, but it was thinner than she'd seen it before. The layer under it, the one she'd been sensing through the void touch for months, was closer to the surface than it had ever been. "And my father was not wrong about what happened to my mother," he said quietly. "But he was wrong about what it meant. About what it proved." A pause. The wolves who crossed that border were 2 individuals acting outside pack authority. The Cray pack leadership condemned the crossing. There was a formal censure. He looked away. "My father never told me that. It was in the records." Vesna didn't speak. "He built the hatred," Harkon said, in a tone she had never heard from him. Not flat, not precise, something more exposed. "He passed it down like it was fact, like it was earned. And I carried it because I was a child and he was my father, and I didn't know there was a different story until I started reading the primary sources." A pause. "Until a wolf with your name walked into my courtyard, and I said something to her that I understood. 3 months later, I had no right to say." The forest was very quiet. The moon was very bright. Vesna stood on the path and felt the void touch doing something it had never done before. Not pulling, not pointing, just settling. Like something coming to rest after a long journey. Like a frequency finding its exact matching note and going still. "You should have told me," she said softly. "About your mother." "I know." A long pause. "I'm telling you now." She looked at him. He was looking at the path, jaw tight, and she understood that this, whatever this was, whatever was happening in the space between them on a cold February path, was costing him something. Not just the admission about his father's distortion, or the acknowledgement that he had carried a wrong story, but the act of being this close to something he couldn't control and had not been able to prepare for. She understood that feeling very well. "Harkon," she said carefully, "there's something I haven't told you. I should have told you sooner, but the timing was, I kept waiting for there to be a right moment, and I don't think there is a right moment for this particular thing." He looked at her. She held his gaze. "The void touch," she said. "What it's been telling me since the first day I crossed your border." She breathed. "It's telling me that you're my fated mate." The forest was absolutely silent. He looked at her. The expression on his face went through something complex and fast. Surprise, because it was genuine even if it shouldn't have been, and then something underneath the surprise that was the opposite of shock. Something that looked, paradoxically, like recognition. "How long have you known?" he asked. "Since I felt it pull into your territory 2 months before I arrived. Since the first day in the courtyard." She paused. "I didn't tell you because I was a Cray wolf in your compound under a watch list flag. And telling an alpha who looked at me like a security problem that I was his fated mate would have sounded like exactly the kind of manipulation my bloodline was dismantled for. It wouldn't have been manipulation. I know that. But I needed you to know it too before I said anything." He was very still. "Does the void touch tell you what I feel?" he asked carefully. "Not specifically. Broad strokes. Emotional temperature." She paused. "Not enough to read you. Enough to know that the last 3 months haven't been uncomplicated for you either." He looked away. Looked at the trees, the moon, the path. The jaw tightening that meant something was being decided. Then he looked back at her. "I have been feeling something since January," he said. "Not flat. Not precise. Just honest. Since the corridor outside the medical wing, specifically, though I think it started before that, and I wasn't paying the right kind of attention." He paused. "I didn't know what it was. I've been in no condition to be objective about you. The name, my father's history, the position it put me in when I made the provisional residency decision. I wasn't sure I could trust my own red." "And now?" she asked. "Now," he said, "I'm standing in the forest with the wolf I told should not exist. And everything I've found in 40 years of pack records is telling me that my father's war was built on grief weaponized into policy. And the void touch that I've been watching you work very hard to manage quietly for 3 months is apparently pointed directly at me." He paused. "And I don't know what to do with that except, be honest about it." "That's enough," she said. "Being honest is enough." He looked at her for a moment that stretched long and warm and full. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes." "When you decided to come here anyway, when you said something told you to go this direction, was that," he paused, "were you afraid of what it meant? Knowing, and coming anyway?" She thought about it honestly. "Terrified," she said. "But the void touch doesn't give you the option of easy. It just tells you the truth, and lets you decide what to do with it." He was quiet. "I think," he said slowly, "that's one of the things that's been hardest about the last 3 months. Watching you make decisions from a position of, you had information I didn't have, and you never used it. You kept doing exactly what you said you were doing. Records work. Helping Culford. Being exactly who you presented yourself as, even though you held something that could have changed your position here significantly if you deployed it differently. It wasn't mine to deploy," she said simply. "It was information about you. About your life. What you do with it is yours." He held her gaze. "What happens now?" he asked. It was the question she had been turning over in the abstract for 3 months, trying to imagine all the shapes it could take, when it finally became concrete. What she hadn't imagined was that the concrete version would feel so much quieter than the abstract one. Less like a turning point and more like arrival. Now we take it one thing at a time, she said. Start with the things we know. The records. Your mother. The war and what it actually was. She paused. The rest of it, the bond, the formal recognition, all of it. That's something we build toward. Not something we arrive at in a forest at night. He looked at her. Something in his face shifted, the composed surface and the exposed layer underneath coming, gradually, into alignment. Into something that was simply him. The man, not the alpha. Both of them present at once. You're the most patient person I've ever met, he said. I've had practice, she said. And then he did something she hadn't expected. He reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, not with ceremony. Just his hand around hers, standing on a moonlit forest path. Two wolves at the beginning of something that had taken much longer than it should have to become visible. She let him. And the void touch, the thing she'd been living with since she was 17, the compass needle that had pointed her through 4 years of itinerant survival into the courtyard of the man who'd told her she shouldn't exist, went quiet. Not gone, not dormant, just satisfied. The way a thing feels when it has done what it came to do. What followed was not a fairy tale. She wanted to be clear about that. The formal recognition of the mate bond brought complications, because significant things always do. The pack had complicated feelings. The watch list notation required formal review at the elder seat level, which took 2 months of documentation and testimony and bureaucratic process that Vesna managed with the same methodical patience she applied to everything. The historical record of the Cray Dravik War was formally re-examined. Harkon commissioned it, quietly, without fanfare, and the findings were added to the pack record. Not as a dramatic reversal, not as a public condemnation of his father's memory, just as a correction, an addition to the record that made it more complete and more honest. It was not enough to undo 23 years. He knew that. She knew that. It was a beginning. There were pack members who found the mate bond news complicated, who had grown up, like Harkon, with the Cray name as a wound in the pack's collective memory. There were conversations, some of them hard, some of them harder than that. And there were people who came around slowly, and people who took longer, and a few who Vesna accepted, without resentment, might take years if they came around at all. Gora, the Brackwater settlement administrator, received the news of Vesna's formal mate bond recognition with the same expression she'd had when Vesna reorganized the filing system, pragmatic satisfaction. I told the compound administrator you were worth knowing about, she said. I told Peter that too, the second week, when he was still watching you like you might be a security threat. What did Peter think? Vesna asked. He thought you were very organized, Gora said, and that organized people are usually either very dangerous or very honest. She paused. He decided you were probably honest. High praise, Vesna said. From Peter, Gora agreed. It genuinely is. Isara, who processed the news with the energy of someone who had been watching a slow-moving development for weeks and was thrilled to see it finalize, told Vesna that she had noticed it in January. In the corridor, after the long night. You sat next to each other like you'd been doing it for years, she said. And neither of you seemed to realize that. We were exhausted, Vesna said. That too, Isara agreed. But also that. The void touch did not disappear with the bond's formal recognition. She hadn't expected it to. The ability was not a signal flare that turned off once its message had been delivered. It was a part of her, had always been a part of her, would continue to be. What changed was what she did with it. She had spent 5 years treating it as a liability, as the thing that made her name dangerous, that made her a variable in other people's political equations, that had contributed to her family's dismantling before she was born. She began, slowly and without announcement, to treat it as what it was. A tool. A perception. The particular way that her biology engaged with the world. She used it, with Harkon's knowledge and agreement, and on her own terms, to advise on alliance situations, the broad emotional temperature of diplomatic encounters, which she could read in ways that had nothing to do with surveillance or political manipulation. She used it to notice distress in the pack that hadn't surfaced in the formal reporting structures, people under pressure that the administrative system hadn't captured yet, situations that needed attention before they became crises. She did not use it to know things she hadn't been told. She drew clear lines and held them, and explained the lines to Harkon, and he understood them without requiring explanation, because 3 months of watching her manage the Void Touch's information with rigorous ethics had given him more evidence than any file notation ever could. The watch list designation was formally reviewed by the Elder Seat at the summer convening. The testimony took 4 hours. The designation was removed at the end of the first day. Vesna stood outside the Elder Seat chamber afterward, in the warm summer afternoon, and felt the weight of 22 years lift off a name that had never actually earned it. She did not cry, because she had never been a dramatic person. She stood in the sunlight for a very long time. Then she went inside, found Harkon where he was talking with the Elder Seat's administrator, and put her hand in his, the same way he had reached for her on the forest path in February, without ceremony. He looked at her hand, then at her face. Whatever he saw there made him stop talking mid-sentence, apologize briefly to the administrator, and walk her outside into the sunlight. "It's done?" he asked. "It's done." He exhaled. It was the same quality of exhale as that February corridor, a man releasing something that had been held for much longer than it should have been. They stood in the summer light, and the name Cray was clean for the first time in 23 years. "There is something I want to say carefully before we close." Harkon told her she should not exist. He believed it when he said it. He had been taught to believe it. His belief was not malice, it was inheritance. The particular shape of grief that never got to become grief because it was turned into policy instead and passed down as fact and held as certainty until the records said something different. And Vesna stood in that courtyard and answered, "And yet here I am." Not with defiance, not with anger, with fact. Because that is what she had learned. In 4 years of being a name that preceded her and a file that distorted her and a person that no one waited long enough to understand. The most powerful thing available to her was simply being completely and unarguably herself. Organized, honest, methodical, ethical, with an ability that other people had used as a weapon and she had chosen to hold as a responsibility. She did not redeem the Cray name by being exceptional. She did it by being consistent, by showing up every day and doing what she said she would do, with the records and the archive and the long nights in the medical wing and the conversations on the forest path, by drawing clear lines and holding them, by telling the truth when a convenient version of it would have been easy, by being exactly who she was, in every room, regardless of who was watching. The bond found her because fate is not very interested in convenience. But the love, the real thing, the complicated and unglamorous and worth it thing, was built the way all real things are built. Day by day, decision by decision, in the specific, accumulating weight of being trustworthy when it costs something. You are not your file notation. You are not the story someone else built around your name before you were old enough to build your own. You are what you do with what you have, in the rooms you're actually in, with the people who are actually watching. And that alone, is more than enough to change everything. I need you to hear me for a second. You stayed through this whole story. You were there for the courtyard, and the East Annex, and the archive, and the medical wing corridor at dawn. You were there for the forest path, and the February moonlight, and the hand reaching out without ceremony. You felt it. I know you did. Because that's why you're still here. This channel exists for the stories that feel real, even inside the wolf and the moonlight and the mate bond. The stories that use extraordinary things to talk about ordinary truths. That you are worth more than your worst day. That love comes after patience, not before it. That the most powerful things, the ones that actually last, are built quietly, in the middle of hard winters, by people who keep showing up. If this story gave you something, even one moment, even one line that landed somewhere important, then please, right now, hit that subscribe button. Not because of numbers, because this is a place where the stories take you seriously, where the people inside them earn their endings, where you will come back next week and find something waiting for you that was made with care. Subscribe, turn on the bell, share this with someone who needs it, and drop in the comments where you're watching from, because I want to know that you were here, that you existed, that, contrary to what anyone has ever told you, you absolutely should.